Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to The Big Idea. I'm Julie Mulvihill. I'm the Executive Director of Humanities Kansas, and we are so glad to welcome you back to our new season of The Big Idea. We took a summer break and we're back. You're in for a real treat today with Doctors Valerie Mendoza and Leonard Ortiz talking about the Vietnam War Latino experience. But before we do that, I just wanted to present a reminder about what the Big Idea really is. It's a monthly online program that we do here at Humanities Kansas as part of this movement of ideas, this idea that, when we provide opportunities to have fresh scholarship and thinking in the humanities, it might spark conversation, engage with new ideas, and sometimes these ideas can even be big, bold ideas. Now, today's a little bit different with the Big Idea because we're talking with historians, but we're also launching a new grants initiative. And here at Humanities Kansas, we are proud to say that we have a new opportunity for organizations to apply for funds for the Kansas Stories of the Vietnam War. Now, some of you may know that it's the 50th anniversary of the military withdrawal from Vietnam. And this is a story that's on a lot of people's minds. There's closure that needs to happen in our communities. A few years ago, I think it was 2017, Humanities Kansas launched the first of this oral history collection of the Vietnam War era in our state. And we were able to work with 12 communities all across the state, from Jetmore and Onega and Wichita and Overland Park, Sabetha, Winfield. It just goes on and on and on. And together they collected, I think, somewhere around 50 to 60 oral history interviews with veterans here in Kansas who experienced the Vietnam War. And those stories have been archived and preserved for families and students and teachers and researchers here in the state at the Kansas State Historical Society, but also in the Library of Congress as part of their National Veterans Project. And so we're excited and humbled to be able to offer this opportunity again. Now, before I turn it over to our historians to have this conversation, I want to invite you to watch a short film that we made after the first round of our Kansas Stories of the Vietnam War to hopefully help you think about why collecting and preserving these stories of our servicemen and women, those who stayed on the home front, and even the refugees, why it's important in telling the Kansas stories. So Leslie, if you don't mind, if you will go ahead and cue up the film and let's take a look.
The first impression was sweat pours over every portion of your body when the plane opened. They put us all on a bus, and you're looking out at a world that is totally alien and foreign to anything you ever grew up with. The old cliche, it ain't Kansas, Toto.
The best people I ever knew, the nurses and the soldiers that I knew in Vietnam, were the best people I ever met in my life. I've met a lot of people since Vietnam, but I realized a number of decades later that, I was looking at meeting people and served with people that answered the call. They were the true patriots.
Well, the food actually wasn't bad. Sometimes, however, we would steal sea rations. There was a sea ration dump in our compound, but it was ringed by concertina wire because they knew that they had to protect it from their fellow Marines like us. But nevertheless, we would sneak in there and we'd grab a box of C ration under each arm and dash out. However, one time I ran into concertina wire face first, and so I was sprung back like running into a giant spring, and I had this kind of very interesting kind of scratch on my face for a while. It looked like I'd really been in something serious, you know. But it was only from stealing C rations.
Joining the military sounded like a great idea, a way to serve my country, and also equal pay for equal rank, whether you're a man or a woman, which was a very unique concept in those days. So I decided to go for it, never having a clue at that time that I would make a career of it, but I'm glad I did.
You know, you get used to being over there. That becomes your family. You know, you take care of each other. You might take care of people that you really don't care for, but you would still risk your life to help save them. If they were in trouble, you'd go out. You knew it, and they knew it.
I might get broke up on this one. It was during the Tet Offensive. We had a unit got pinned down and were under fire, and we had to go out and drag them back. And I was going out with them, and had a guy didn't even know he was trying to drag back one of his buddies. And I had to tell him that he was dead and to leave him because we still had some wounded out there. That was it. Up until my daughter-in-law died, that's the hardest thing I've ever done.
I guess you'd say I have a lower stress level now because I don't fear dying. I don't think there's anything that's going to happen to me that isn't ordained some way. I do things with a purpose that tomorrow is tomorrow, today is today. If I can't get it done today, I may not get it done tomorrow because I may not be here. But I'm not worried about it. And for being the age I am, I think that I'm pretty lucky because there's a lot of my folks of my age are passing away every day.
Last winter at the wall again, snowing and very cold. It seemed we were alone until a man and a woman reflected in the granite from behind us. For a long time I watched them inside the stone. When I turned, I saw them weeping. "Do you have someone here?" I asked. "Just the two of you," she said.
So to continue this conversation, I want to introduce Dr. Valerie Mendoza, who works in the public humanities and is here to visit with historian Leonard Ortiz. So Valerie, take it away.
Thank you, Julie. Welcome, everyone. We are very excited that you're here. Leonard and I talked before, and we have some great conversation in store for you. So I'd like to introduce my guest, Leonard Ortiz. He's Associate Professor of History at Baker University. He received his PhD from the University of Kansas and is an expert in the American West and 20th century U.S. history, which includes the Vietnam War era. So welcome, Leonard.
Thank you.
So you write about stories from the Vietnam War in your Big Idea essay, and I'm wondering how you came to be interested in this period and specifically the war.
Well, that interest came very early in my life, as believe it or not, as a child. Growing up in California in the 60s, I had an older brother who had just was finishing high school in 1967. And I think a lot of young men at that time knew that if they didn't go to college, it was probably going to mean being drafted. And he wasn't he wasn't planning on going to college. I think part of that was because during that period, college wasn't really encouraged for young people of color, whether it was institutional. There just wasn't the systems in place to encourage young people of color to go. So that wasn't on his radar. And he knew then that ultimately he was going to get drafted. And so we talked about it. And as again, I was just 10 years old. And he knew at the time that if you got drafted, you didn't have as much choice unless you joined. And so he was trying to decide which branch of service to join. And we have an uncle who was a career Marine, served in World War II, Korea, and was stationed in Okinawa during Vietnam. And he contacted my brother and he said, son, your best chance of survival is to join the Marines. And I really encourage you to take that route. And he did. And so my brother and I got on our bicycles. He was just turned 18. I was turning 11. And we rode to the Marine Corps Recruiting Center. And we got him signed up, stopped at A&W on the way home for a root beer. And then we went and told our parents. And my mom immediately started crying. So at that point, everything in my life, as we were just focused as a family on where my brother was headed in the Marines from boot camp through his tour of duty in Vietnam. And so the letters started to arrive from the first day of boot camp all throughout the war and a few months after the war. And we've accumulated well over 200 letters that I'm putting together for a book. I'm editing them. There's a picture of on his 19th birthday where my mom had sent him a birthday cake that got there in about 2 weeks, and she sent party hats and streamers, but they did eat the cake. I don't know how fresh it was anymore, but that was one of the photos that he sent us from after receiving his cake. So yeah, I was kind of becoming more not interested in the war, but it was part of our family now. As I said, the letters started to come, and my job as a young man was to young boy actually, was when I got home from school, checked the letter in the mailbox, and my mom worked for a wealthy couple taking care of their children in Atherton, and I was to find out if there was any letter that had arrived, and if it had, I was to read them to her immediately. And so I remember her crying on the other end of the phone as I read these letters to her as a 10-year-old, and there were times when I could hear my parents crying in their bedroom, just wondering if he was still alive or not, because even though we received letters regularly, they would take a long time, several weeks to arrive. It's not like today with instant messaging. So we had to wait and wait. So I was drawn into it. I didn't really have a choice. I think also growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, I was, 35 miles down the road from Berkeley, which I know you're very familiar with, Dr. Mendoza, and which was kind of the beginnings of the student movements. And just a few miles down from Berkeley was Oakland, was where the Black Panther Party was established, and across the bay was where the countercultural revolution started with the Summer of Love in 1967. So we were exposed to that. We were influenced by that. And as I said, as a young child from that point on, I became very involved in what this was all about with Vietnam, and then having the opportunity as a professor to learn more and do research and teach about it, it became very much a focus of not only what I teach, but a part of who I am as well through those
Yeah.
experiences.
What formative experiences as a young child? I mean, I can just so vividly picture you two riding on your bicycles to that, in enlistment office. And then, like you said, your unique experience in that San Francisco Bay Area where, your brother's in Vietnam and you have these letters and, the worries and stress for your family. But then at the same time, you're pretty much in the heart of the anti-Vietnam protest movements as well. So, yeah.
Yeah. It was interesting because we were frightened, but yet we felt excited that we were trying to do something to create this change, because by that time, 68 or so, people began to realize or ask the question, what were we doing in Vietnam? And so, and the families would ask that too. But just being in that home with parents who are grieving every day and in fear of whether their son is alive or not, just had such an impact on me that it just never went away.
Yeah. So you mentioned your brother in the war. What are some of the unique experiences of Latino soldiers in the war?
Okay. Well, I think it's much more complex because, and we have to be careful what Latino experience might be, because are we talking about Puerto Ricans from New York? Are we talking about Cubans from Florida who might be on different ends of the spectrum politically? We have Mexican Americans who served in Vietnam from liberal Kansas. We have Mexican Americans who served from San Francisco. And so they might have a different experience, I think, more when they return from the war. And we'll talk about that later when we talk about student protests from the Chicano communities. But I believe, from what I've read and what has been told to me, that when these soldiers are on the ground in Vietnam, the horrors of war, and it was mentioned in that wonderful documentary, that they took care of each other because war does not know color. PTSD does not know color. They had each other's backs. They would not leave anyone behind. They would always make sure to bring the soldiers back, whether wounded or dead as well. So I think in that aspect, they were a team. They were a unit. They were together. Of course, when they were back at camp, sometimes they would settle into groups. I've seen photos as well. I've heard of some soldiers would put Confederate flags on their tanks, but I don't believe that was really meant to be racist more than to be rebellious and show how strong they were as soldiers and so forth. So there are differences in terms of like structure, that we know that only about 2% of officers were officers of color. The rest were white. And we know that kind of reflects society at the time too, where most people in power tended to be white in the 60s. Politicians, police, lawyers, bankers, teachers, professors were mostly white. So it's not a surprise that even in the military, those in leadership were white. And I think soldiers felt that as well, recognized it. There was another unique difference would be the disproportionate numbers of soldiers of color who fought in Vietnam. For example, I believe African Americans at the time were about 12% of the population, of the United States population, but they were 25% of those enlisted in the U.S. Army. For Latinos, and I use the term Latino, Mexican, Hispanic interchangeably because people across the country use it differently as well. There were about 200,000 Mexican Americans who served in Vietnam. The population of the United States was about 10% Mexican American, but almost 20% of those who died in the war were Mexican American. So disproportionate in terms of the population. Why? Why is that happening? Again, a lot of it is many soldiers of color were recruited at higher numbers because they weren't attending college, and some had even dropped out of high school. There's one story, an oral history, where a young Mexican American from Los Angeles in 1967, who eventually joined the Marines, had said that when he was in high school, the colleges and universities would come to recruit the white students, and the military would come to recruit the black and brown students. I thought that was so telling. And I think that's another example of why we see these disproportionate numbers. And to be fair, poor white men who couldn't go to college, couldn't afford it, often were drafted in higher numbers as well. So a lot of it was socioeconomic, which can be seen as discriminatory in a sense as well. So.
Yeah. Well, and these disproportionate numbers, like you were talking about, is one of the reasons that led to this significant protest at home, at least among Black and Brown communities. So can you talk a little bit about that? And then what this looked like in Kansas? Because I know you've written an article specifically on the publications of the period by Chicano activists.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because oftentimes we see what happened in the Hispanic communities follow what was already happening in the Black communities, especially when you go back and look at World War II. A lot of the protests that happened in the Black community happened following World War II. So when these soldiers came home after fighting for, life and liberty and happiness, they were denied those freedoms at home. And then we start to see kind of the civil rights movement begin. We know that, for example, the GI Bill, which was a great thing, helped a lot of veterans. It was very discriminatory because even though it was a federal program, it was administered by the states. So, for example, in there were, and the GI Bill would provide low-cost loans for veterans to buy homes or go to college and find better jobs. But when we see how that was distributed, for example, in Mississippi, there were 3,000 VA loans that were administered to white veterans, and only 2 of those went to Black veterans in 1947. We saw in New York City and northern New Jersey, 67,000 mortgages that were distributed to white veterans, and only 100 were taken by soldiers of color. So this was catastrophic economically for soldiers of color, mostly African American and to some degree Hispanic, because it denied them access to home ownership. It denied them access to higher education and better jobs, which denied them generational wealth that is needed to maintain a certain degree of living in this country. And we know to this day that people in Black and Brown communities are still catching up because of that. So that was kind of recognized after the war, but what's really interesting about the kind of the Chicano movements and the Chicano moratorium that kind of came out of this was that the Latino communities began to recognize this as the war was still going on. For example, the disproportionate numbers of soldiers that were fighting was recognized as it was happening. And that was like one of the first concerns among many that started to articulate in the Hispanic communities across the country and in Kansas as well. And again, I think a lot of Hispanic communities were looking at what the Martin Luther Kings were doing and the Malcolm X's and so forth. And they recognized that they were in similar situations. So in Kansas, which was interesting because it didn't have the high density population that you might see in Los Angeles or San Antonio or Houston, But they organized and began to articulate the concerns that afflicted them, lack of opportunities for jobs, education, discrimination, and they began to really get the word out through publications of newsletters, community newsletters, and for example, that mostly these newsletters were produced by churches and also local community organizations. And so they would share not only the concerns and they would be ways in which the Hispanic communities could know where to go to get help and get support, and where the rallies were going to be, and what type of services in the area could be provided to them for various needs. And they also served as a kind of a way to express pride in one's culture, because they celebrated. It wasn't always something that they were fighting against, but they would also use these newsletters and periodicals to celebrate different events that were happening in the Hispanic communities, fiestas, celebrating September 16th, on and on it goes. So there was a lot of pride in culture, a lot of literature that promoted the contributions in the Hispanic community, but also at the same time addressing needs and that were of concern that Hispanics felt like they did not have access. And so largely peaceful with the protest, never violent. And this was one thing that was really unique to the Kansas City area, the Kansas City Topeka corridor. Even in central Kansas, we've had activities that came out of Newton, Kansas, down in Liberal, some in Salina as well. And so it was really important. And once these soldiers returned and saw that they were not going to be having access to some of the things that they really should have had the constitutional right to have access to, they joined and became leaders in the movement, just as leaders from World War II, Black leaders from World War II, came in and became leaders shortly after World War II into the 50s. So it was really exciting to see what they were doing with the walkouts. It was very proactive. It was well organized. And they made sure to address as many people as they could, largely again through these periodicals and newsletters.
Yeah, so those periodicals and newsletters sound like, a correlation to today would be like our social media, right?
Yeah.
So how to get
Right.
the word out. So if you couldn't maybe attend the last rally, oh, here's the newsletter, and you can see what you missed, what's going on in the future. Really a way to mobilize community. And it's really interesting to me that you say that a number of them were through churches or affiliated with churches in some way as well.
Yeah. And it just shows what the challenge is, because as you mentioned with social media, how easy it is to get the word out. I mean, you can imagine these people making copies and putting up posters on walls in cities, and it was just much more of a challenge, but they were incredibly successful in like you said, getting the word out.
Yeah, because it's not like you can go to the printer and make 20 copies, right?
Right.
You do
Right.
it on a
Yeah.
mimeograph. Well, before I ask you your next question, I just want to let everybody know that if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat or the Q&A feature, and we will get to those as well. So switching gears just a little bit. So we talked about, well, I guess maybe not, kind of a segue. You talked about, soldiers coming home, kind of becoming leaders in the Chicano movement. But your essay also talks about mental health and veterans, Vietnam veterans in particular, and challenges they faced when they came home. So can you tell us a little bit more about this and PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome?
Okay. So, and we should start by saying this is not new. It's not something that's mutually exclusive to the Vietnam vets. That throughout the history of warfare, soldiers have suffered through ailments because of catastrophic trauma, And like I mentioned in the essay that, some people used to call it battle fatigue or shell shock, had different names for the same ailment. And it wasn't until the 80s when research was, I'm sorry, earlier in the 80s, after soldiers began coming home, but highlight showing that there was a definite type of disorder associated with trauma, and that's when it became known as post-traumatic stress disorder. And as I said, it's affected Hispanic soldiers as much as it would any soldier, black or white. And again, like I said, it doesn't discriminate. And what is unique, I think, is that this is one of the, I think, could be the first war where we really begin to see this talked about. World War II veterans, we don't want to talk about this. We don't, a lot of times there was silence, not always, but there was oftentimes these things that happened to soldiers were not discussed. And we see so much of this come out from Vietnam veterans that at first there was kind of a stigma associated with the Vietnam veterans. Like, why do they have so many problems? Why do they have so many ailments? Why can't they return and function in society? So in a way, it was good that we started to see what was going on and what they were experiencing, and also the dysfunction that came from returning from war as it affected families. And also, we began to understand that PTSD isn't just associated with war. Any type of trauma or traumatic experience that someone has will have potentially PTSD. And it still continues to be a struggle, not just for the soldiers, but for their families as well, because of the ramifications that permeate from the individual, especially where we're talking about veterans here, how it affects relationships within the family, the distrust that comes with that, the anger, the fear, the guilt, and sometimes the violence, the addictions. And so it's not just a soldier struggle, it's a family struggle. That's why I wrote in my essay, The War Never Goes Away, because it affects every soldier and to a degree their families every day because of the struggle. Because when I read these letters and listen to some of the oral histories, what these young men and women who try to, we're talking about nurses, what they had to see is just horrific, absolute horror. And I just can't imagine getting through that. And so we're seeing progress because I think the Vietnam vets kind of paved the way that we need to take this seriously. And we recognize now with our vets who have come home from tours of duty in Afghanistan or Iraq early on that we now can anticipate these kind of challenges for veterans when they return. So it's something that has gone from being looked down at to something now we recognize, and we're being more proactive, I believe, with how we deal with soldiers and people from all walks of life who experience some sort of trauma.
Yeah, and I think there was a quote you mentioned in your essay by a soldier who said, like, when he was in Vietnam, he had an outlet to channel his anger and and emotions, because there was a quote unquote enemy. But when he got home, there was no place to channel all these feelings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm glad you raised that point, because what was allowed, thousands and thousands of miles away from here in a foreign country is not acceptable when you return home. And so what do you do with this anger? My brother, oftentimes, when he's frustrated, it could be something as simple as his car's not ready from the auto shop, and he believes they gave him the runaround, and everything's amped up to a higher level. And he goes, "What am I going to do, Leo?" He says to me, "I can't go Vietnam on them. What do I do?" So simple things like, why isn't the mail here? Or why is my car taking so long to get fixed? It doesn't have to be something very, what we would consider, oh, it's just an inconvenience. With PTSD, it's raised to a different level that people oftentimes feel threatened. But you're right. How do we deal with this? And that's why it takes so much support. And I also think that projects like what Humanities Kansas has done to listen to these soldiers, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about the soldiers' experience coming home, to it helps them to realize and understand that they do matter. Because for so many years, I think society kind of looked down on Vietnam vets. But with these type of projects that allow soldiers to make the choice whether they want to share their experiences, I think is a way to not only honor them, but show them that they truly do matter. And I think that may help heal some of the wounds.
Yeah, and I know one way that we as a country helped with that healing was the creation of the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial. And I know we had some photos that we wanted to show that. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one of the things with we kind of asked the question, what happened, how were soldiers really treated after they came home? And there's the stories of the spitting on soldiers and baby killers. And I know that my brother was told when he returned to wear civilian clothes, not his uniform, to avoid any conflict. But it didn't help much because he still had the Marine Corps haircut, so that people could tell he was a soldier. I think um, some of those stories are true, but I think a lot of that is embellished. It wasn't the norm for soldiers to come back and be screamed and yelled at. This did happen. But I think it has been embellished over the years because students who were protesting in the 60s were not just fighting to end the war. They wanted to bring these young men home because they began to see them as being pawns, victims in this war that didn't make sense to anyone. And so there was kind of this concern about soldiers at that time. But as again, with all the challenges that came with PTSD, there was a stigma associated with these soldiers. But I think that has changed for several reasons. And I think a lot of it has to do with listening to what they have to say, whether it's through the oral history projects or the letters that they share that sometimes turn into books. This was a photo that I took. I was in DC in the spring. I love it when they send busloads of students in to go visit the monuments and go to the museums. And this was a group of kids who were headed down, as you can see, to the wall. And I tell you, the first time I went to the wall, it took me probably a half hour, 40 minutes. I saw it. I didn't want to go there. I started to tremble because I knew it represented what my brother had went through. And oh my gosh, it was so hard. And to see these kids take it so seriously and show so much respect, it just showed they're going to go pay respect for these soldiers who gave their lives. And so when I have guest speakers into my classroom, one of them was John Musgrave, who lives in Baldwin City. He was in the Ken Burns documentary. He was featured as in the Ken Burns documentary on Vietnam. He came and filled out our auditorium to speak, and he's come to my classes. And every time he's done, the students get up and they line up and they go to greet him and say, "Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service." They want to talk. They don't leave the class. There seems to be this transition now towards reverence and respect for our Vietnam vets. And I really believe that part of it is because of things like Humanities Kansas has done to give them a voice, right? To show that they matter, to show that they're human beings. And it's comforting. And I know for my brother, who's been very bitter towards society, I should have pulled it out. I was going through some of his stuff yesterday. There was a letter that a bunch of kids from elementary school wrote to him and to thank him for his service. In his community, they have a small wall for veterans who have served. And he got this letter from a classroom full of kids, and their little writing, "Thank you, Mr. Ortiz." And that just moved him. And I think that's so important when we think about these types of projects and conveying the messages and experiences of our veterans.
Yeah, and I know we talked a little bit before that, and you mentioned to me an assignment that you give to your students that also kind of goes to what we were talking about. It's an oral history assignment. The students are asked to interview somebody, from what I understand. And in recent years, you said the Vietnam War is becoming a recurring topic
Yeah.
among them. What have you and they learned through this assignment?
Well, it's interesting because when I started doing this 20 years ago, a lot of the stories would be on World War II vets or grandparents who lived during the Depression. And as that generation has passed on now, a lot of the students are doing grandparents or uncles who were in Vietnam War. And then we're starting to see a lot of interviews on 9/11. So it just kind of moves through time. But one of the things, well, there's two things I think the students get out of it. One is a greater appreciation for the family member who they're interviewing. Almost every paper, because I never had an opportunity to talk to my uncle or my grandfather or father about these type of things, to know things that I didn't really know. So there seems to be a better connection between the student and the parent or grandparent. Um, there seems to be greater respect and understanding, as I said earlier, in general, but also within these families for um, the people that they're interviewing. And it seems like the the interviewee is appreciating as well the opportunity to tell the story. One of the things that's interesting, though, when I look at these, because these are obviously stories from the Midwest, is that most of the um, veterans who are interviewed, um, I would say probably a ratio of 2 to 1, maybe 3 to 1, aren't really in combat, but stationed in Vietnam, working on bases or flying, air bases, supply depots. So most of them aren't really in combat situations, very few. And it makes me wonder why. Why is it that a lot of the ones that I'm getting these papers, we're not seeing that. So I don't know the answer to that at this point. I do also notice that communities seem to be very supportive in returning soldiers to Kansas, largely because I think the small towns that some of these families come from, there's going to be much more support. There's no protest against the war. It's all about supporting your neighbor's kid who's coming home from the war. They also talk a lot about having knowing a neighbor or family friend who's lost a son overseas as well. But definitely regional differences in how soldiers are treated when they come home. I think largely because these are areas that are fairly rural, where you're not going to have a lot of organization to protest against the war itself, where you might see in New York or San Francisco, Los Angeles. So they are fascinating, and I think the students really appreciate because they're learning about things that they had no idea were in, stories from a relative. So
Yeah. So as we wrap up, I just want to read a couple of comments that we've had in the chat. So from Dennis, he says, I'm very proud of the establishment of the Veterans Court in Shawnee County District Court this year. Also, Topeka's crisis intervention team program makes a big deal about diverting veterans away from jail to get help. So again, speaking to kind of mental health and treatment of veterans. And then we also have another comment. It says, the daughter of a Vietnam combat veteran, I've seen dramatic change in the way the culture treats veterans. It used to be that the war was never acknowledged or discussed. Now strangers will stop us thanking him for serving and asking question. And again, we're kind of noting, like what you mentioned, that change in the way that veterans veterans are acknowledged. So thank you so much, Leonard. This has just been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your time. I'm going to throw it back to Julie.
Well, thank you so much. I could have listened longer to this as well. And I'm just really appreciative of your expertise in this area and your lived experiences with your family, Leonard, that really brought this to life. And I guess a couple takeaways for me is that really Stories matter. History matters. We can't help but think about how this generation of the Vietnam War generation informed and shaped our communities as people either stayed home during this era or left and returned, changed, and how some of those decisions that individuals make were informed by their experiences of the war, whether at home or abroad. And so I just think that this is a really fascinating topic, and I'm grateful for your generosity in sharing your expertise to both of you. For those of you who are on this Zoom call or who might be watching it later recorded, we hope that you'll take a look at humanitieskansas.org and find out more about our grants initiative to preserve and share more of these Kansas stories of the Vietnam War. So be sure and check that out. And we invite you to come back next month to our next Big Idea topic. We are scheduled for Friday, October 20th at noon. And we'll be joined by Dr. Mariama Graham, who's a distinguished professor of English at KU, who'll be talking about her new book, The House Where My Soul Lives, which is the life of Margaret Walker. And we're really looking forward to learning more about the life of poet and writer Margaret Walker. So there's lots to come. Thanks again, Valerie and Leonard. We really appreciate it.